All right, welcome to our free prep hour. I'm Dmitry. Today we're going to be talking about everything verbal. And specifically, the theme today is working with what you know. I think a lot of people get a little bit discouraged on GRE verbal, or they don't get discouraged, but they can get complacent and think there's no more work to be done because they kind of figure, well, either I know these words or I don't, or I understand this passage or I don't, and there's not a lot I can do about it. And there's really a surprising amount you can do about it. And I think one of the biggest mistakes people make in verbal is that they just think it's about memorizing a lot of words and then going over very specific details about passages rather than realizing that there is a repeatable process that won't fix everything, right? But that will get you through these with greater accuracy. And that a lot of it has to do with using what you do know. What do you understand about the passage? What has the passage told you? What is the sentence telling you? What clues are in the sentence? What words in the sentence do you know? Are you familiar with that you can use to lean on? And don't focus so much on what you don't know. There will probably be some things you don't know. There will be some words you don't recognize. There will be some concepts that don't make sense. And those are important to think about. And of course, later on, you want to review and say, how could I have known that? Or how could I have figured that out? Or how could I memorize that word? But that's the part that won't entirely change because, okay, great. You learned that concept, you learned that word, but then there's another concept and another word. So I want you to get really comfortable working with what you know because what we know is finite and it always will be. Um, and we can't know everything there is to know on the test, but we can work better with what we have. And that's where we see a lot of progress for most people. So I'm going to be pulling a lot of problems today from our 5-pound book. You can get this for practice, but it's just that's the source of all our questions today. We're going to go through all the major verbal types, and I'll kind of go in order the way a section would. So we'll start with text completion, then we'll do a logic-based reading comp, then we'll go back to vocab with sentence equivalence, and then we'll come back to reading comp. During that, I want to focus on really understanding what we're reading, the comprehension process, prediction. I think people tend to leave that stage out. A lot of times I'll ask someone, hey, what word did you predict for this blank? And they'll say, well, the thing I didn't like about A or B I liked because of this. And I said, no, not what did you choose? What did you predict? And they kind of look at me like, huh, predict? Even if I've said it 100 times, I have to say it 100 more times. We want to get used to predicting on verbal. You want to make it a default assumption that you have some kind of prediction. Sometimes it's a very vague, nebulous it's going to be something like this, and sometimes it's more specific. But we want to have some idea of what we're looking for. We don't want to go into the answer choices unprepared. And then we'll work around the stuff that is less clear to us that we don't know. So let's model this. Again, we'll go in order. Text completion, reading comp, sentence equivalence, back to reading comp. So starting with text completion, if you're familiar with all your GRE question types, this is the type where you just fill in one word per blank. And so here there's just one blank, so we're filling in one word. Um, so what I would usually do is read over the sentence. Don't worry too much about anything that's not clear. I didn't choose to start with one that has a lot of really obscure vocabulary here. So you might find that this sentence is fine. But read the sentence over and think about what might go in the blank. Um, so yeah, take a moment to do that. All right, so any predictions? What kind of word or words might we put in that blank? I've got some kind of dispute. There's little agreement about whether the Second Amendment provides blank guarantee or whether it was instead this, right? And so there's some background stuff, right? If you're a US citizen, you might know what the Second Amendment is referring to. Um, If you're not, that might be less familiar, but you don't necessarily have to know it. You don't have to have heard of, honestly, you don't even have to know what an amendment is, right? If you just recognize that there's little agreement about whether this thing provides a guarantee or whether it was instead meant to do something else, right? Some kind of guarantee or something else. Um, so key word to start with is this contrast word. And we're often looking for what we call a trigger, no pun intended with the Second Amendment stuff, right? But we have whether instead, right? Which implies a contrast. But we have to be very careful because if I just try to contrast what's immediately on either side of it, I might say, oh, are we contrasting a right to bear arms with allowing the populace to protect itself? And you might get confused because you might say, well, isn't that why people want to have arms? Like, despite what you and I might think about guns, you might say, well, someone who wants to own a gun isn't part of their motivation, maybe that they want to protect themselves. That doesn't necessarily seem like a contradiction, right? Um, but if I add on to that and say, oh, wait, but not just protect itself in lieu of a military. So it seems like they're saying, does the Second Amendment mean you can protect yourself in place of the military? Or does it mean that you have the right to bear arms as a private citizen? And so I might be forgiven for thinking then we don't need this blank at all. I could just say, oh, so does the Second Amendment either guarantee your right to bear arms, even as a private citizen, or does it just allow you to protect yourself outside, instead of the military? Um, so I might not feel the need for any word in the blank at all. Of course, there's going to be one. But I could probably then predict that it's going to have to be something that means a, uh, something like a strong guarantee, right? A definite guarantee, um, a general guarantee, right? Not just for some people or some situations, right? Some kind of word that's saying, yeah, it really is a guarantee no matter who you are, no matter what the situation, right? And then that would be the debate. Is it just for specific things or is it overall? Okay. So we want some kind of word like that. Is we okay with that prediction? Okay. Now, what I'll do is I don't want to make any assumptions about what words you know or don't know. I'll assume you know a lot of words, but I'm do what I'm just going to do is I'm going to simulate a situation where we don't know all the words. Let's say you get to the answers and you see something like this. What do I mean by this? You see ABC and you go, okay, I know these words, but you see D and E and you say, huh, I don't know these words at all. Right? Let's say these are just absolute blanks to you. And I want to blank about entirely because I don't want to, again, I don't want to assume whether you know these words or not, but I also don't want to encourage anyone to try to guess a meaning of a word based on how it looks or sounds. That doesn't tend to work out well. So what I instead say is, okay, well, what do I think about A, B, and C? Do I think the answer could be one of those? And by the way, notice that if you felt a little funny plugging in an answer, if part of it was that there's a second word, an earnest, an amended, a questionable, maybe that makes it more sense to you, makes it make more sense to you where you go, oh, there's whether the amendment provides a something guarantee, because I wasn't sure exactly what word to put there, right? So it really, I should have put a definite or a general guarantee, a strong one. Okay, so out of these words, are there any you feel pretty confident that we can cut? Cut C, a questionable guarantee. Yeah, that seems to go the wrong way, doesn't it? If it's a questionable guarantee, well, we're already questioning it. So we're not going to debate about whether it's more limited or whether it's questionable. That seems to go the wrong way. Okay. What else can we cut? If we look at amended's kind of funny. If I didn't really know much about amendments or what they meant by an amendment, I might just say like, well, they talk about an amendment, maybe. That would make me a little nervous though. Is it just grabbing language from the text? If you know that amended means it's been changed or revised some way, I don't really know that the amendment itself provides an amended guarantee. That's kind of confusing. I don't think that's going to be very likely. And then earnest is tricky, right? When you're earnest, You're very honest, straightforward. You say what you mean, kind of thing. And I don't think we're arguing about whether they meant it, right? We're arguing about what they meant, but we're not thinking that they were sarcastic or something like that. Oh, you could totally have a gun, right? So we're not worried about whether they meant it. Right? We just don't have any information about that. That could be a concern, but we don't know. Okay. So what I could say at this point is I'm down to a 50-50. And that's really important. If you don't know these words, if you don't know D and E, then you absolutely want to have the courage to say, I'm going to pick one of those if you're pretty confident A, B, and C are right. The problem is in these situations, I might look at these first few words and say, hey, these are more comfortable words. I'm more at home thinking about the answer being one of these words because at least I know what they mean. And what I sometimes do is I try to force a word in. I sometimes call it shoehorning. I try to make that word fit where it doesn't belong. I might say, well, questionable is going to fit with the debate. Yeah, it is, but I'm not going to say there's a debate about whether it's questionable or not, right? That's not what they're saying. So I want to pick that 50-50. Okay. Now, if I know more words, I can get further. Um, so the question is why? So why for sure not A? So earnest means like serious or honest. Yes, absolutely. But it doesn't mean particularly strong, right? I'm not going to say, oh, there are, like, for instance, there are earnest penalties for murder or something like that, right? In other words, they're major penalties, right? It's just going to mean that I meant it. And so there's no indication here that we're debating about whether the amendment was really meant to give the right to bear arms or whether it just wasn't meant to do that. We're worried about in what context or how it was meant to give you the right to bear arms. And it's not about honesty or integrity or sincerity, right? Which is what that would imply. Uh, okay. So that leaves us with D and E. Now let's add words in. Okay, let's say I do know D, or let's say I see D. Now D is a word a lot of us don't know. I would say most folks do not know this word. I've never used this word in my life, ever. I don't know if I've said it aloud. Maybe I'll say it aloud now for the first time on camera. Defeasible. No one says this word. Okay. So that's probably a real question mark for most of us. So I'm going to keep that as a question mark and say, hey, maybe you know what this means. Good for you if you do. You're in the top 1% of vocabulary people out there, probably, if you do. But I'll keep that as a question mark. Let's go to E. Huh. That's maybe a more familiar word. And if it's not familiar, again, I don't try not to guess what things mean, but I might have an idea about which direction it would go. How do you feel about E as an answer? Could the idea of an ironclad guarantee apply to one that is definite or general applies in all cases, things like that? If you think about ironclad meaning like clad in armor, wearing armor, covered in armor, it's solid, absolute. And so again, I don't usually make up meanings for the words if I don't know them, but if you are familiar with this, then that's the one we want, right? And I don't need to know what defeasible means to get this right? Um, defeasible is not that different from if you think about feasible being something that can be done or is likely or believable. This is kind of like that, but this is specifically that you can take it down. It's almost like defeatable, right? Would be the closest. And so that's kind of opposite of what we want again. So that's also a wrong way if we know that. But again, most of us won't, and we won't need to know it to get this one right. Okay. So let's try it again in another one, again with the idea of prediction. This one's a little bit harder to predict, I think, but let's see if we can go through the process. So take a minute to try to do this. And if you can, actually write down a word, even if it's a guess, even if it doesn't feel great, write down a word for one and a word for two. So take a moment to do that. This one's a little heavier, and depending on your comfort with vocabulary, you might have found a few words that you're not 100% on, right? Um, I've got orthodoxy. I've got unabashed approbation. I might even have pounce where it's like maybe you know that word is like a cat, but you might not be entirely clear what they mean by it here. So there's a lot here. And if I look at this and I don't feel great about prediction, I might not spend a lot of time predicting, or it might depend on what I see in the words. I might glance at the words and say, do I know some of these words and the answers? Because if I don't know these either, then maybe I don't want to spend a lot of time here. Um, but if I know one part of it, I might not need to know all the rest. So for instance, if I look at the second blank, I see that the critical reception was surprisingly blank. So in other words, critics' response to this book was surprising. But in what way was it surprising? So what do we know about how the critics responded? Well, we know they met the text with unabashed approbation. So it seems like very likely, even if I don't know the word approbation, that it's basically saying they met it with a whole lot of something, right? Whether that's positive or negative. And so I'm going to have a word, something like that. It's probably not going to be something that's, say, neutral, right? Um, if I don't know what approbation is there any other clue about whether this word is positive or negative? I might look at that word pounce, right? And say, huh, okay, if they usually pounce on something, I think of a cat pouncing on a mouse or something like that as an attack. So it's like critics who usually attack didn't, right? That's what the usually part is getting at. And so even if I don't know what approbation is, which is you approve of something, you like it, I know that that word needs to be positive, right? Now I know that. For the first word, I'd say, okay, well then, well, what do I know about this book? I could just guess and think that maybe it's a bad book. Hey, critics are usually mean, but they like this book. Uh, maybe maybe I was surprised because the book was bad. But I might want to look a little bit more at what it is that critics attack. They attacked orthodoxy. So I might just fill that in as my blank. Now, if I know what orthodoxy means, then I know what kind of word I want. If I don't know what orthodoxy means, that's tough because then that word probably won't be in the answer, and I'll have to still interpret which of these could match orthodoxy in meaning. So that might get me in trouble. But I can have something like this as my prediction. Okay, so then when I go to the answer choices, I'd probably want to lean on blank two first because I'm more likely to be sure what that is. I know it's going to be something good, right? And if I want it to be good, what can I cut out? Again, these words are a little harder. Deprecating. We most often, for whatever reason, we most often hear that word as self-deprecating, like when you put yourself down. But deprecating in general is putting something down, diminishing its worth. Okay. If you're not sure about the other two, it's a 50-50. But if you know tepid means like lukewarm, kind of so-so, right? You can't be, normally I jump, but now I've been unabashedly so-so, right? And unabashed means you're not embarrassed, you're full-throatedly, wholeheartedly doing something, right? So you're not going to be wholeheartedly saying right? So laudatory, to laud something is to praise it. That's what we want. Okay. So then I need a word that means orthodoxy on the first blank. And here's where I might have to just know what that word means, right? This is where I might be out of luck if I really don't know, especially because the vocabulary for the first blank is fairly difficult. Um, but if you know orthodoxy, if you relate it to religion, right? Most commonly you hear about someone being Orthodox Jew, right? A more traditional adherent of the religion in a more literal way, right? You see Orthodox Christianity, etc. But it's outside of religion. It's anytime you stick to a doctrine pretty fully and you kind of go with the way that you think it was really supposed to be, basically, right? Whether other people agree with you or not, it's more traditional, conventional, which is the word that they go for here, right? As opposed to someone who's breaking boundaries and trying to do things different or shake it up, right? Um, Ingenuity is inventiveness. That doesn't sound, you could be inventive and traditional, but it doesn't sound particularly traditional or orthodox. tortuousness is nothing to do with torture. It has to do with twists and turns. It doesn't really make sense there. So I might have to guess about what that meant, but I wouldn't have to know it if I knew that conventionality worked, right? And thankfully, of those words, maybe conventionality is the nicest one. Okay. So, am I going to get this one perfect if I'm missing a whole lot of these words, right? If I don't know what orthodoxy or approbation is, I might have a hard time. But even just if they usually pounce, just knowing that the second word is positive, if I know that and I can get rid of even one of the words in the second blank, then I'm going through from a 33% chance to get that blank right to a 50% chance of getting that blank right. And we take every edge we can get. Okay. So we're using what we know, and so this might still be inspiring you to bust out the flashcards, and great, do that. Add any of these words you didn't know to your deck. But when you take the GRE, will there still be some words you don't know? Almost certainly so. Therefore, make sure that you're doing as much as you can to work with what you know and work around what you know. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit toward a reading comp. So on the GRE, for whatever reason, they have the same label, reading comprehension, for what other tests would call two different things: the logic-based ones that are shorter, and the passage-based ones that are the passages tend to be a little bit longer, although they're not always that long, and have multiple questions. On the GMAT, they call these short ones critical reasoning. On the LSAT, they call them logical reasoning. The GRE is like, it's all reading comprehension. It's all the same. The reason I make a distinction today is partly that if you're only going to have one question about a passage, then you probably want to read that question first because you really want to know what your task is, right? Am I supposed to be attacking this argument? Am I supposed to just be understanding what the main point is? Am I supposed to be inferring something from it? Like, what is my job? Whereas if I'm reading a passage and I'm going to have, say, 3 questions about it, I have enough to do. I'd rather just focus on understanding the purpose and structure of the passage, and I'll get to the questions later. So for this one, it's a single one. And so I want to read the question first. Which of the following can be most properly inferred from the statements above? I want to talk about a couple of the word choices here and make sure we're aligned on what this means on the GRE. So first off, the word most. I want you to basically ignore this on the GRE. They're just being careful, right? And the reason I say that is because I'll say things like, which of the following would most weaken the argument? And people will say, oh, well, B and D, like those both weaken the argument, but D weakens it a little more so that win wins. When in fact, if D is the answer, then B shouldn't weaken the argument at all, really. And here, if they're asking us to infer something, and whatever A is the answer, then the other answer should not be something we can infer. It shouldn't be like, well, we know it more. It should be like either we know it or we don't. And so the most is just them being careful and saying, well, technically, maybe you could argue for more than one of these, but which one's the real one? So don't get too hung up on most. The other word here is infer or inferred. And this basically just means what can we know? In real life, sometimes we think of an inference as a guess or some kind of leap or something that's likely. For instance, if you tell me um, some things about yourself, like what political party you believe in or who you voted for, or what kind of music you like, or you tell me whether you have tattoos or something like that, I might guess some other things about you. I kind of might build a profile of you. And statistically speaking, I might be right. Maybe if you're, a liberal voter, you're more likely to support cause X, and if you're a conservative one, you're more likely to support cause Y or what have you. But that's just a guess. I don't know about an individual person unless they tell me. Um, and so the GRE can't test that kind of uh, probabilistic stuff of, hey, if you like this, you probably like this too. You know. Um, so what they're really testing is what do we know? And so that's a really tricky one to predict when you read something because you're going to read a bunch of statements. They're going to say, well, I know all this. And so these are hard to predict on, but I want to look back and say what's supported. So take a moment, if you haven't already, to read over this little blurb here, the statements. It says above, but to the left. And then we'll think about how we might infer something from this. Take a moment. So I don't know about you, but I don't feel like I really have enough to go on to make a prediction here about what the answer should be. It's just something that I know. And the answer could be anything. For instance, here's a really dumb one, but one of the answers could be there are many companies in the United States. That might seem like a very silly answer, but it says many companies in the United States do this, so there must be many companies. If there weren't, that couldn't be true, right? And that's kind of the answer that you could have because we're just looking for anything that's true, right? Or it is possible to purchase a private aircraft, right? Or when they talk about there being in compliance with the law, you know, the companies are legally able to buy aircraft, right? Or things like that. And then they have the things about the majority of the businesses being for smaller and mid-sized businesses, and flights are for mid-level employees. So we have some proportional stuff. But again, I don't really know what to predict on that. So what instead I have to do is I have to kind of run through and say, can I prove this? And I really want to be able to look back at each answer and say, okay, do I have evidence to say like this is definitely true? And what I encourage you to do as you run through the answers is to focus less on finding the right answer, although of course that is our goal, and a bit more on getting rid of the ones that you're pretty confident are not supported, and then coming back around as needed to investigate further. So think of it as sort of a first pass where you're going to say, could this be true? Maybe. Should I hold on to it? Or do I know it's wrong because I just don't have the support? Right. So what are the more likely candidates? And then I'll dig in more as needed. So let's kind of look at them one at a time here. Um, this one says the federal law in question costs businesses money. So what do you think about this? Should we hang on to this or could we cut it out? Do we know much about businesses' costs? Do you know? I might think about what the alternative is. The law is saying that I can't reimburse. I don't know what kind of company I'd work for where they'd reimburse me for owning an airplane, if even if the law allowed it, but it's pretty fancy. So it's basically saying, if Manhattan Prep wants me to fly around on a private airplane, they're gonna have to buy me one because if I buy one, they can't pay me back. But is that losing the money? Do they want to pay me back? You'd think it would be more efficient for a company to buy airplanes for the company as a whole and use them when you need it, rather than let everyone buy their own private plane and we pay them back. Um, and so I don't have to know a lot about the economics of airplanes or if there's savings to be had one way or the other, or how expensive the plane would be, or what the insurance costs. If I start thinking about that, I know I'm in over my head, right? So what it comes down to is I just don't know where the savings are. I just don't have enough information to answer that. I'm going to cut A. Okay. What else have we got? B. Most executives would rather fly on company-owned planes than on commercial airlines. So talk about the preference for these planes that companies are buying versus, just fly in on United or American or whatever. Can I find support for that? Is there someplace that might match that, or should I cut it? It doesn't say anything about preferences, right? And generally, I really watch out for anything that adds an element of emotion or feeling or opinion to something that hasn't described any of that, right? Sometimes that might seem obvious. Like, what if you said something like, um, Fred needed to take some time off after several of his loved ones died. Okay, can you infer that Fred was sad during that time? I mean, I kind of hope he was, right? Because it would be strange if he weren't, if his loved ones died. But did they say anything about Fred's frame of mind or feelings or emotions? I don't know, right? So although I would imagine I would be sad, right? I don't have specific proof about how someone else was feeling or what their preference was. So this would rather business, I just don't know. They just say what they do, not why they do it or whose preferences are behind that, right? If my company does something, are they doing it because that's what I want? Or are they doing it because that's what they want, right? That's not clear. Okay. What about C? Large businesses usually have their executives fly first or business class on commercial flights. It says the vast majority of the business aviation fleet is owned by small and mid-sized businesses. Um, so it might make sense then that since there are large businesses and presumably there's a lot of people, that those people must be flying commercial. What do we think of that? I'm not sure. I hang on to it. Could be. Okay, let's hold on to it. D. Upper level executives are less often in compliance with the law. Okay, so this is getting to that same part of like, hey, most of these planes are for smaller businesses, and most of the people on them are mid-level employees. Okay. So what about the upper level executives? Do we know if they are less often in compliance with the law? Yeah, no, I mean, one way we could come back to this if we need to, but one way we can tell is that the law isn't about what the executives can do, it's about what the companies can do. And so the companies aren't allowed to reimburse a person. A person themselves isn't breaking the law, right? It would be the company that was breaking the law by reimbursing them. And they've said the companies are in compliance with the law anyway, right? So maybe there just aren't as many upper level executives. I mean, I think that's probably a fact, right? There's probably a lot more middle managers than upper managers. That's kind of why they're upper. But I don't have to know that. I can just say, hey, I don't know about anyone breaking the law. Okay. What about E? By not receiving any reimbursement for these flights, the mid-level executives on board are complying with the law. Hmm. Again, I might think, well, I don't know that the employees are the ones that are supposed to follow the law anyway. It seems more like the company that is prohibited from reimbursing. But I mean, maybe I could make a case for D or for E that it's still you're still supposed to not ask for reimbursement, right? For something like that. So that might not feel 100% clear. So I'd have to think about what do I know about these, right? So C is talking about people flying first or business class of commercial flights. E is talking about being in compliance with the law. So then I might look back and say, okay, do I have more specific text that talks about, for instance, commercial flights? If small businesses are the ones sending people on these airplanes, do I know that large businesses are using commercial flights? Is there any other possibility? I mean, maybe large businesses lean more on trains or cars, right? Or if they are sending people on flights, do we know that they're sending them first or business class? I remember seeing one point that Walmart was really into like, sticking with their thrifty brand and even sending their rich execs on like coached seats. But we don't have to know anything about that or get into that. Again, this is use what you do know. And what we know from the passage is just that most of these flights are for mid-level businesses, but we don't know how large businesses are solving that. We don't know whether they're using commercial flights or whether they just don't fly as much, or whether they have something else, some other solution going on. Okay, so we don't know about that. Okay. Yeah, maybe a small and medium make up the large majority of businesses. Now, unlike with executives, though, a large business is probably does have more people in it, right? Like, uh, if you look at something like, I don't know, Amazon, right? A lot of people work for Amazon, right? And yeah, there's only one Amazon compared to like all the little stores or things that it might have displaced. But there are still a lot of people that work for it. And you might expect they have to fly, but we don't know how they fly. So we don't want to have to get into the details of, the US business world or anything like that. We just want to say, hey, do we know that they are specifically flying this way? And so one thing to watch if you were tempted by this answer is I just know nothing about first or business class. I know nothing about those things. They never mention them. Okay, so that leaves me with E, and E is really not saying very much, and that's why it's a good answer. So one thing to watch for in inferences is that the less ambitious they are, the less they are saying, the vaguer they are, the better they are. That's kind of like I said earlier that if one of the answers said there are many US businesses, you jump right on that one, right? Sure, there are many US businesses. Yes, absolutely. That's true because they said many companies, blah blah blah, right? So I look at E and I say, oh, all they're saying is the law says you can't get reimbursed, and these people are following the law. Okay, so then in not getting any reimbursement, that fits the law. Okay, that just kind of stitches together what they already told me, right? It's not a very interesting answer, but it's a correct answer, and that's all we're looking for. Okay, so watch out for things that are speculative. Hey, maybe it's because they'd rather fly on the company-owned planes, that require you to make guesses about trade-offs, like what costs more or how they accommodate their executives, right? Or that ask you to make comparisons you don't have information about, like, hey, the upper executives do this less, right? We maybe know there are fewer upper level executives represented in this group, but that doesn't necessarily mean we know anything about their compliance with the law. Okay, so we're really sticking to what we know on an inference, and it's a pretty absolute thing there that if an answer choice goes even a little bit beyond what we're told, other than real basic things about the world, fire is hot, people buy things with money, stuff like that, just very essential stuff that we know about the world, we're not supposed to use it in inference, right? We're not supposed to bring a lot of our own personal knowledge to bear on this. Okay. So that simulates the first two parts of your test, right? First, you'll get some text completion, which are meant to be done about a minute a piece. If they're multi-blank, they might be a little longer, right? And then the reading comp is meant to take about 2 minutes per question, including your reading time. And then back to sentence equivalents. And sentence equivalents are back to more like the 1 minute thing. Anything that's vocab based, it's got to be closer to a minute so you have time to slow down and take your time on the more reading intensive parts of the test. Okay. So let's fill in a word for this one. Oop, did I flash the answers? Okay, well, we might have had a peek at them, but um, let's think about what goes in here. So what kind of word did we fill in? Okay, we're trying to conceal something. Notice that if you don't know the word foibles, really doesn't matter, does it? Right? If you don't know that word, or maybe you've heard it loosely, but you don't know exactly what it means. Uh, I'm still talking about, hey, social media, word gets around. The only way celebrities can hope to conceal their blank is by employing practices blank as those of aspiring. So the foibles could mean they're, naughty pictures or something like that. It could mean their political views. It could mean their upcoming projects. It can mean anything. It's just something we're trying to conceal. It happens to mean like your minor little flaws and quirks, right? But we don't need to know that. So again, work with what you do know. We know that they're people who are famous and they are trying to conceal something. Honestly, even if it was a fancier word than celebrity, right? If I didn't know what a celebrity was, right? If I just knew the only way that someone can conceal something is by using practices like aspiring, then I need something like, yeah, secure or secret. Right? Okay. Um, so let's try some of the words. And what I'll do is I'll show some of the words at a time. The idea on these sentence equivalents is that you're going to choose two words. And you don't just choose two words that each of which could go in the blank. You choose two words that have the same function in the sentence, that basically mean the same thing. You could argue that no two words in English mean exactly the same thing, but they should have the same effect in the sentence as each other. They shouldn't be complementary words. They should be more or less identical words. Okay. So uh, if you don't know any of the words, obviously, then you're having to guess randomly, and your chance of guessing correctly randomly is 1 in 15, which is not great for choosing a pair out of 6. But if we can narrow it down even a little bit, it increases significantly. One tool you can use that we've talked about in some other workshops is just the idea of making pairs. Maybe you look for words that mean the same thing as each other and say, hey, it's either this pair or that pair. But you don't always know, or there might be triples, things that where you think, hey, 3 of these might go together, but which are the 2 that really go? But let's say that we know half the words. We'll just give you the first 3 words and cut out the second 3. Given that we want something that's talking about the secretive ways of aspiring, something that was secure, something that's careful. Um, Out of these words, does anything appeal? I'd say probably the most familiar word out of these for most people is conspicuous. And conspicuous, can we agree that if you're conspicuous, you stand out, right? You might stand out by your absent. Like, oh, Dmitry was conspicuously absent from the gathering or something like that, right? But it stands out. And we definitely don't want to employ practices that stand out if we're trying to be secretive. This is the opposite. Okay. The other words are harder for most folks, but if you could just get rid of this, that alone takes you from a 1 out of 15 to a 1 out of 10. You've already improved your odds by getting rid of even one word. Okay. If you know the other 2 are wrong, so much the better. And they are. Arduous means difficult, right? Not quite what we want, like an arduous task, an arduous pathway, right? These practices might be difficult to employ, but the practices themselves aren't supposed to be difficult. Difficult isn't the purpose. And draconian is like brutal, like a dictator, or draconian laws that are really severe, right? Uh, and again, you might say, well, yeah, I want to be really severe in my security, but no, that's not. It's not describing that, right? Draconian would be like really really negative, kind of nasty, and usually would refer to how someone gets treated, not to your security practices. Okay, so if I know conspicuous, I get to a 1 out of 10 just from that alone. If I know draconian or arduous, right, and maybe you didn't, but maybe you do know one of the words in DEF, right? Now, what are your chances of getting this right? You're supposed to pick 2 words, which means you want to choose one word not to pick, right? So either it's not D, it's not E, or it's not F. So your choice is now 1 out of 3. If you can get this far, you're 1 out of 3. Okay. And that's a really big difference. You're 5 times more likely to get it right than if you didn't narrow it down at all. And so that adds up over time. So part of what we're trying to do with the GRE is work every angle we can. Should we learn more vocabulary? Absolutely. Should we, get faster and more efficient at our reading? Absolutely. But should we also just look for every little leverage we can to say, hey, this is what I could expect from the blank. Here's what can't go. Yeah, we need to do that too. Okay, so I'll reveal the second half of the words. You can give us your best shot at this if you think you know what 2 should go. Um, Duplicitous and cloaked are both interesting. Talk about something cloaked in secrecy, or in sci-fi, like cloaking devices on the ships and stuff like that, right? But I guess there's real life cloaking too. Huh? But fanciful doesn't really make sense. Right? So we're left with these words that basically both mean they're not quite a perfect match, but they're 2 words that both have to do with being deceptive, being secretive. Okay, so that's what we want. Right. So that one's a little harder, but we want to work our prediction as much as we can and get rid of anything that we can in there. Yeah. Okay. Good. Let's do one more prediction, see what we can fit into this. Okay, so here's some other interesting vocabulary, right? You might not feel wonderful about the word blandishments. And you might not know what we mean by the intended mark. But I do have a couple clues that maybe are a little clearer. First off, I see that this person isn't just a real estate salesperson. I see that they're a real estate con artist, right? Okay, if I know what a con artist is, it's someone who's trying to trick me or scam me in some way. And I'm saying, despite whatever they're doing, the intended mark, whoever that is, remained blank about the value of the plot for sale. And now as means it's going in the same direction as it seemed to border a swamp. So in that case, how should we remain about the value of the plot? What is a good word to go in that blank, even if I don't really know the green stuff? There's a con artist involved. The value, the plot is bordering a swamp. What's a good word to fill in to describe how we see the value of the plot for sale? I think skeptical is a good word, right? So if you happen to know that blandishments are attempts to persuade, often through flattery, right, or trying to win someone over, that could be helpful. If you know that a mark is someone that a con artist is trying to fool, like, oh, I look like an easy mark, so they try to scam me out of money or something like that. If you know that bit of I guess you can call it slang, then that makes it a little easier. But notice that you don't need to know it. And the reason I'm getting at this, it would take up a very large part of our time if I were to give you like a really dense, intense science passage. Um, but on those, of course, we can get really overwhelmed. Am I supposed to know all this chemistry or all this history or whatever else it is? And in general, just no, I'm not supposed to know that stuff. And so I also don't need to know all the words. If I do, does it make it easier? Sure. Are there sometimes cases where I can't be sure I'm right without those words? Absolutely. Right. Imagine I didn't know what a swamp was. You probably do know what a swamp is or have a rough idea. But let's say they'd use a more difficult word there. It seemed to border a blank, and you're like, I don't even know if that's good or bad. But even if I didn't know the word swamp, if I knew the con artist part, um, or if I knew something about the mark or blandishments, I might have some other clue to say, oh, I don't think that this is a good thing right here. Um, versus if they said, border a, beautiful lake or something like that, then you might feel happier about it, right? So sometimes when we don't know one word, we can figure it out through knowing another of them. The more words that are missing, the harder it gets. Of course, that's kind of how it is, right? Eventually, I keep replacing it. It's in another language that I don't know, and I can't read it. But up until that point, there's a lot I can recognize. Okay, so again, we're going to choose two. Am I going to get rid of those three? So out of A, B, and F, what could I cut? Optimistic is positive, right? Enthuse, you're enthusiastic, right? So A and B are kind of a pair. That's out. What about F? That's not a word we use maybe as often. I could keep it. Okay. So at this point, I'd have some options, right? Assuming that I know that, and the point of crossing out C, D, E is that I wouldn't know these. So let's say we do know F, and F feels like a good match, which it does feel like a good match, right? Then I'd have a 1 out of 3 chance again, right? Because I know that Leary works, which it does. And so I'd have to guess which of the other three. But again, I would really love to have 1 out of 3 if it seemed like I was very far from that, right? So Leary basically is like wary, cautious. You're not too sure that something's going to work out. So I do want that. So if I don't know these other 3 words, then I am going to uh, take my 1 out of 3 shot. If I do know some more, I can get a little further. Jaundiced. Huh. Well, that's an interesting word. It can be a physical thing, right? Your body produces too much bilirubin and you get yellow. Sometimes we're jaundiced as babies, right? Um, that seems odd, but usually when we see something like that, if you're familiar with that usage, you must think there must be some metaphorical usage because they're probably not talking about medical stuff here, right? And jaundice can mean like bitter about something. Like if you often hear people say he takes a jaundiced view of it, which is basically like he doesn't look on it very favorably, but specifically like kind of like he's been burned before. And so I could see kind of being drawn toward that one. Um, Skeptical. Oh, now jaundice doesn't look so good. So it really depends on what else is there. Once skeptical is there, unless I'm gonna ditch Leary, I'm gonna say okay, jaundice isn't it. Whereas if I didn't know whatever word was there that meant skeptical, I might look at irascible. Do I know that? Irascible means you're irritable, easily angered, right? I don't want that. Okay, so I end up with this one. Jaundiced isn't quite right because although someone who takes a jaundiced view might not look at it positively, it implies a sort of bitterness that we don't know that this person has. We just know that they don't seem to believe that the land is as valuable as the real estate con artist says. We don't know what their past experience has been, if they're mad about it or what have you, anything like that. We don't know. Okay. So, not a perfect thing. Obviously, if you're missing more of the words than I was, simulating, then these can get harder. But if I know even some of the words, I can get a long way. And so, it's very valuable to supplement your vocabulary work with other stuff. And in fact, I would maybe even say to keep your vocabulary work as secondary to the main work of comprehension and answer elimination. And vocab is a supplement to that, but it's not the main deal. Okay. Um, We'll come back one more time to inference, and I'm going to let you do this all at once since we're nearing the hour. So I'm just going to have you pull this one in when you've got it. So this is a short passage. What I'd like you to do, normally with a short passage, you'd read it first and then read the question, because you'd have 2 or 3 questions. Here, since I'm only going to give you this one, if you want to read the question first, you can. But we want to think about how does the part they're asking about fit into the overall purpose? And which of these things can I know is true rather than I'm guessing? Right? I want to feel like I'm not guessing. I want to feel like this is provable. Again, the theme is work with what you know. We don't have to know anything about this topic coming into it. Maybe you do, but we don't have to. But we want to look at what do we know that the passage has told us. Okay, I'll give you a little time to read this over and put your answer in. All right. So here's one where there's definitely a couple of traps that we've got to watch out for. And it can partly get back to our idea of prediction. So if I go to this passage, there's a lot that I might not feel perfectly understanding of. And again, you might or might not have some context. You might know about James Baldwin. Um, again, there are a lot of things that this might rely on, right? Are you American? Do you spend a lot of time thinking about, the race situation in early 20th century America, things like that? Okay, so different backgrounds we might bring to this. Um, but what I can see is he's talking about being an outsider, right? Feeling like an outsider in terms of power. Um, and he's talking about being a child, and so he's an African American child watching these Hollywood movies that were centered around white people that dealt with issues that related to white people. Um, and then he says a child is far too self-centered to relate to any dilemma which does not somehow relate to him. And so that seems to say that, hey, if these movies were about other kinds of people, maybe these aren't relatable, right? Maybe though, it depends on what you're watching, right? Maybe I see someone on the screen who's not very much like me physically, or they don't look like me, but maybe their concerns are mine. Maybe they want to be with their family, or they're in love with somebody, or something. Maybe that's relatable. But okay, but what does he say? He says watching these films, he tried to relate the information to his own life, connecting with it however he could. So okay, he saw a staircase. Hey, a staircase, I know those, right? So staircase is kind of a funny pick, right, of all the things you might have in a movie. But the point is he would find something to say, hey, this is familiar, this is recognizable to me. Um, and so it seems like specifically what I might say is, uh, it was hard for him to relate to these films. Now, what is it saying about 1930s America, not just him? Well, maybe it's going to be a generalization. And if you look at the answers, they're pretty much all generalizations. They're not just about James Baldwin, right? And so maybe a better prediction for me to say would be to say that it was hard for people in general to relate to films if they weren't the ones being portrayed, right? If they were feeling left out. So what answers fit that? Huh. Is that illustrating the culture of power? I mean, they talk a lot about culture of power. I don't necessarily know a lot about that. I might feel I could hold on to that. The fact that Hollywood movies were primarily optimistic and centered on white culture. Notice that they say exactly these words, right? They talk about them being optimistic. Whoops. They talk about them being optimistic. They talk about the white aspect, right? Um, but that's not necessarily a good thing, right? Because in terms of an answer, um, because just because there are words from the passage doesn't mean that they're saying that's why he said this. So did he talk about how children relate to movies to talk about what the Hollywood movies were actually doing? No, that can't be. Right? He's talking about his reaction to the movie, not just the movie itself. C is interesting. The idea that that America was hungry for a writer such as Baldwin because its film focused only on white America. I could go either way through this. I could say, well, it seems like they weren't, right? Because it seems like people just wanted to make movies about one kind of person. Or you could say on the contrary, right? First off, he actually became a famous writer. We're reading about him. And, a lot of people in America were left out of this. And so maybe there was a real great demand for something different, right? For someone representing more than just, one group of people. Um, but it feels very speculative, doesn't it? Right? They don't really say what people wanted to see. And so getting back to that, hey, we don't know what executives are preferring or something like that. Other than Baldwin himself talking about how children see films, we don't really know what people wanted. B is interesting. The alienating effect of films of the era on black children. Well, he was a black child. Was he alienated? Was he left out? Maybe. Hold on to that. E. Now, E is often the most popular answer. The concept that children are capable of deriving any educational value from films they can't relate to. Here's why you should cross this one out as soon as you see it. Sorry. This basically looks like it just says what they said. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to get you all turned around and say, don't say what they said. But if E were the right answer, who would miss this question? Right? If they simply asked, hey, what does a quote mean? And then all the answers said random stuff, and then one of them said the quote, you go like, okay, yeah, I guess it means that. That's what they said. but what's the purpose of it? Okay. So I should be nervous about E because it doesn't seem to be telling me the purpose. It just seems to be trying to regurgitate the quote. Now you could say, okay, but like if someone says something, then they do want to say that, right? If I tell you that I love chocolate, right, then you can infer that I love chocolate. It's true, right? I must be trying to tell you that. And if I tell you that I'm allergic to chocolate, okay, then you can figure that out or whatever it is, right? But E doesn't even quite say what it said, though, right? If we look at the quote says, "A child is too self-centered to relate to any dilemma which does not somehow relate to him." And he shows how he was having a hard time relating to what he saw, but he would try. But notice that E is not about relating to, it's about deriving any educational value from. And it's saying the word incapable. That right away, I have to watch out. Um, Putting those together, this is not saying about what you relate to or not. It's saying if you don't relate to it, you won't learn from it. That's a completely different statement, right? I might read a story that I don't relate to at all about someone who's different from me, maybe about someone who's different enough from me in terms of their beliefs or behaviors that maybe I don't like that character. Maybe I read about a character that I disapprove of, like a murderer or something like that, right? So maybe I don't relate to them. Could I learn from reading about that person? That's a different thing. Even as a child, could I learn that, hey, when you murder people, you get in trouble or something like that? Sure, I could. I don't necessarily have to relate to anyone in it. So E is a very tempting answer because the language looks so much like what's in the passage. But that should be our clue to really slow down and say, is this what they're actually getting at? Are they actually talking about whether children can learn anything? No, they're talking about how we relate. Having said that, that leaves us with A and D. A talks about the culture of power. D talks about an alienating effect. If I look back, what is the culture of power? Right? He grew up as an outsider to both the language and the culture of power. The language of power, a culture of power. Okay. So what is that? Right? Um, a culture of power in which Hollywood movies portrayed an optimistic capitalist white America that dealt with these issues. So it's a it's a cultural force that portrays certain people and gives them importance and maybe leaves some other people out. Um, but does the quote about a child illustrate the culture of power? If it did, that would mean the child in place was the filmmakers, right? That the filmmakers were like childish people who only related to themselves. Hey, maybe they were, but he's talking about himself as a child. So although certainly he might be saying it the other way, he might be saying that the filmmakers were incapable of relating to him. That's interesting, but he doesn't make that specific point. I got to cut A. Whereas D, he doesn't talk about children in general. He doesn't even talk about the race of the viewing child other than himself. But what he does say is kids can't relate to portrayals that don't relate specifically to them. And then he talks about how the portrayals are all about white people. And so you put that together and say, hey, that might have made it harder for kids like Baldwin to relate to the films. That's the one, right? And when we say that, we're not saying that like I couldn't enjoy a film about someone who looks different from me, right? Or even that he couldn't, but just that his point is saying that kids have a hard time making this connection, and the films would have reinforced that with their content. Okay. And so, as you'll often see with inference questions and purpose questions, they're going to stitch together a couple ideas, but they're not going to go too far beyond the text. And we're going to have to watch out for things, something like C, something like E, that make leaps either toward what that must have meant people felt, or that take what they've said and make it more extreme or more general, right? Oh, if kids can't relate, then they can't get anything from it. Oh, close but not quite. Okay, so that's what I mean by lean on what you know, right? Sometimes that's what you know in terms of vocabulary and understanding words. Sometimes that's just what you've been given in the passage. But as much as possible, we're really trying to rely on that and not feel like our answers have to be as guessy, up to the point where we're out of ways to eliminate, and then we freely guess for what we have left. Okay, I hope this is a useful walkthrough your verbal section. If you want to check out any of our classes, we'd love to see you. You can always take class 1 for free to check it out. Um, We also have a bunch more of these workshops available on YouTube, and you can check our schedule for upcoming events. Stick around if you have any questions or thoughts for me. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed. Best of luck with your GRE and have a great night. Take care.